if you're ready then.
All right.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to today's Irish Studies Research Seminar from Queen's University Belfast. My name is Peter Gray. I'm the Director of the Institute of Irish Studies. And we have, as is customary for us now, a split audience. We have some people with us in person here at Queen's. And we've got quite a few people, obviously, as well joining us through Teams. So whether you're in the room or online, you're very welcome. Just to let you know, if you are joining us online, we are recording this session. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, you just turn your camera off. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions, both for people in the room and online, after today's presentation. So I'll come back and let you know how to do that if you're not familiar with Teams just a little bit later. And if you could turn your microphones off, if you're joining us online, that would be great. Then we won't get feedback. Great. Okay. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome today's speaker, who is Dr. Robbie Turner. Robbie recently completed his PhD at the University of St Andrews, working with Dr. Tim Wilson on NoGo areas during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and that's what he's going to speak to us about today. So this is fresh research, almost straight from Viva, which was successfully completed. So Robbie's going to talk to us today about no-go areas in Northern Ireland, 1969 to 1972. So Robbie, over to you.
Okay. First of all, can everyone hear me? Just want to make sure that's good. Okay. Thank you very much for a start. It really is an honour to be sitting here saying this. I always feel I'm a Dubliner, so I always feel it's a bit like the proverbial Coles to Newcastle coming up to Belfast and talking about something to do with Northern Ireland, but hey, here goes. So the subject is the no-go areas between 1969 and 1972. They are the barricaded areas on both sides, and I wanted to sort of like look as much as possible on the whole collective experience on both sides between those years. A lot of people have heard of them, not many people actually know about them. And what references, and I found the secondary sources were particularly weak, to say the least. What references there are to them are usually in their demise. That is to say, the 31st of July 1972, when the British Army launched Operation Motorman and just clear the barricades in just one day. And frequently I found in an awful lot of quite standard text, that was the only reference there actually was to the no-go areas. Where there's better references is usually their connection with the politics and the military situation, which, needless to say, is all very important. But I got to admit, maybe me, no, hang on here. A whole load of people have just barricaded themselves off, thrown the police out, won't let the army in. Who's governing the place? How are they handling law and order? How are they handling things like, I don't know, bin collections, transport? And I found that extremely difficult to actually find out. Well, secondary sources, virtually non-existent. So that's what kind of perked my interest. I wanted to know about this sort of thing. It also struck me as a sort of like curiosity that this was probably completely accidentally and non-ideologically one hell of an experiment, and quite a large one and lasting a long time, in anarchism. And I thought, okay, so how did it work out? So I decided to do the research. Well, somebody has to, and there's one not born every minute, so that not happened to be me. So I decided to do the research on it. First, I suppose, big question, how to define the no-go areas. It sounds obvious. They barricade themselves off. They won't let the police in. They won't let the army in. That sounds like a no-go area. Okay, it's not so complicated. It's not so simple as that. It's a little bit more complicated, because then you have to ask big questions like, what about rebel governance? What about, say, the experience of the province of Munster in the Civil War, which was effectively fell to Republican forces? What about Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, where they actually governed an entire territory about the same size as Germany? And so we decided, now nothing is absolutely set in stone, but myself and Tim thought a good rule of thumb would be that it comes from within the community rather than, in actual fact, a military campaign in which towns are taken, cities are taken, areas, countryside even taken, and rule imposed. I wanted to do it in a comparative because there actually are comparative analyses, and some of them are quite strikingly, glaringly obvious and absolutely in your face. The Paris Commune of 1871, the Barcelona anarchists of 1936-37. Others, surprising. The Paris Commune, by the way, I should add, was at the time the NoGo areas were frequently compared to the Paris Commune. There are at least one reference in The Guardian and another reference in the Irish Times in October 1969 to the Paris Commune when discussing free dairy. Some of them are surprisingly absent. One which should have been, I would have thought, very, very close to the NoGo areas of Northern Ireland, because A, it was happening at exactly the same time, and B, it was also another divided society, ethnic conflict, and that's Cyprus, the Turkish Enclaves. They were remarkably ignored at the time. They didn't like comparisons with the Turkish Enclave. I might come back to why later. And I decided to throw in, just for the comparative sake, it wasn't quite, I'm cheating a little, it wasn't quite a no-go area, but it definitely was. It's an Irish example, and I might as well throw it in this, all our centenary celebrations. It was an Irish example of where British authority lost control in an entire city, more or less. And that's also rather ignored, Limerick Soviet of 1919. So our definition of a no-go area is that it comes from within the community. That is things like the Barcelona anarchists, that is things like the Paris Commune. It actually is things like, obviously, the Turkish enclaves, and it is, as we will see, the Limerick Soviet. I suppose, why the no-go areas? Well, apart from, I thought, the obvious sort of like, my God, you know, this begs huge questions about the citizen and the state, about governance when citizens suddenly start barricading their streets off and throw the state out. I kind of get militant about this because the kind of prevailing fashion is it must have some relevance to what we understand today. And I'm a real sort of it's there person. I'm a kind of militant education for education's sake. Who cares, the monkeys? But as it turns out, I think I was answered towards the end of writing the thesis. A real one actually happened right then and there in real time as I was writing the thesis. And that was in Seattle, in America. And it was happening, of course, in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter protests. And one of the things that was most interesting was that they actually had at various points, they took over an area called Capitol Hill in Seattle, locally known as Cap Hill. And they actually had at various entrances, you are now entering Free Cap Hill. Now, it's kind of easy to get excited about that and say, wow, they knew all about free dairy and all that sort of stuff. But you are now entering free dairy was actually itself taken from a protest by Berkeley University students in 1964 when they took over a faculty building and had written on it, you are now entering free Berkeley. I'm going to assume that American radicals would know this. So it might not necessarily have been our own dear free Derry. But nevertheless, it was a remarkable coincidence. And it also emphasized, in a way, I'm slightly letting the cat out of the bag because I'm going to end with, did it work or not? And there was mixed reviews. But in one respect, they were successful, the Northern Ireland ones. And you can actually clearly see that with what went wrong in Seattle. At the risk of sounding like some right-wing vigilante, no police and no attempt at governance. They were a mixed bunch in Seattle. They were a mixed bunch in all the NoGo areas, except actually the Loyalist ones, but I'll come back to that later. Fractional, so was Free Derry. But they managed, nevertheless, to agree on certain things. Poor old Seattle couldn't agree on anything, and I mean anything. They also came from an ideological position, which was that police were the enemy, full stop. The police were just there to coerce the mob. They were there at the beck and call of the bosses and the state. And if police go away, there'd be no crime. That, unfortunately, is not what happened. Drugs dealers moved in. There was actually a rise in crime. An awful lot of residents said were moved out because they actually said it was unsafe. So eventually, after about a week, it collapsed. And the governor, who was incidentally a Democrat, was able to stage their own Operation Motorman and send in the police, and there was actually very little fuss and it was dispersed. So it's a case of what went wrong and what went right. So now I want to kind of look at what went right. A brief chronology of the NoGo areas. Ordinarily, you would not in a seminar actually deal with a chronological history, but this is so little known. It's one of those people do not really know what happened and how it happened and why it happened, that I think it kind of deserves to be just a very, very brief chronology. The first one was almost an accident. It was, they came in three phases. There were two in 1969, and there was one very, very large one in 1971 to 1972, which was then joined, so to speak, by the Loyalists. The first one was entirely an accident. It happened in January, right at the very beginning of the year, and happened in Derry. It was after the Berntollett Civil Rights March had been attacked. There were disturbances in the city centre of Derry, and there were also that spread to the Bogside area where there were serious allegations made about the RUC and their behaviour. There was to be a protest against the police actions the next day, marching to the main police station down Strand Road. The organisers of the march, the civil rights activists, were frightened there was going to be more trouble. So they organised that it would only be women who went on the march. In the meantime, they sent a delegation into the RUC to discuss the events of the previous night. And in the course of the discussion, it was agreed that the RUC would stay out of the Bogside area for at least a week. So the first Free Derry actually took place between January the 5th and January the 10th, very, very short time. It was meant basically as a protest. It was meant as a sort of slap on the wrist to the RUC. You see, we didn't like this, stay away. It was not meant to be permanent. Now, that's how it's mostly reported. But of course, the reality was, almost by accident, they found themselves with a district to run. They set up a defence committee, and this is kind of interesting. The defence committee was primarily concerned with defending the neighbourhood from potential attack by Paisleyites. They set up Vigilantes, which were, again, that was their main purpose. They manned barricades. They were there to protect the community from attack. However, they did find they had a community to run, and practical day-to-day things Suddenly the Defence Committee said, okay, I suppose we'll have to take care of this. Law and order issues. It was an afterthought. They initially didn't think in terms of law and order. It was accidents like a vigilante patrol was walking down the street and suddenly they came across a burglary in progress and thought, well, we can't just walk on. So they intervened. They hadn't ideas about setting up courts or anything like that, but they were moving in that direction when the civil rights movement and the activists gave the all clear for the barricades to come down. And so ended the first no-go area. Now, the first no-go area's significance is that it set a precedent. It showed something could be done. You didn't actually have to deal with the RUC if you really didn't like them. You didn't even have to deal with the state. You could actually take control of the matters yourself. It was only a week, but it hadn't been a disaster. It actually worked out pretty well. Now, there was a long gap, and of course, as everyone knows, then along comes August 1969. And the barricades actually went up again in the 11th of August, not the 12th. It wasn't actually on the day of the Apprentice Boys March itself. They were anticipating trouble, and there'd already been disturbances then involving the police with serious allegations of police behaviour. And it was decided we'll do the same thing again, upcoat the barricades. When the disturbances, rioting started with the Apprentice Boys March, the RUC kind of attitude was no, not this time. And they made a concerted effort to actually break through the barricades. And that's, of course, precipitated the famous Battle of the Bogside. And what was significant was, surprisingly, for a lot of people, the rioters won. The RUC were thrown out. Similar events started happening in Belfast. An awful lot of the literature revolves around the sectarian violence, the Bombay Street getting burned to the ground. But in actual fact, there was also attempts at barricading nationalist areas and holding them off against the police and the crowds at the same time. When the dust had finally settled, the British troops move in. Actually, the barricades are still there in both Derry and Belfast. And suddenly the people behind them are in no mood to take them down. And so the British government really and the British Army, who have now more or less effectively taken over from the decision making from Stormont, which looks weak and is discredited, decides on a softly approach, and the barricades are agreed to stay. They want to negotiate the barricades down. Now, this is a very, very long period. This lasts from about August, if we take from the time the British Army moved in, from about August 16th, 17th, until about October 10th. Now, it's complicated by, in Belfast, it's particularly complicated because whereas in Derry, there is one single authority. There's the Defence Committee for both the Bogside and the Cregan. In the case of Belfast, there are no less than 23 separate no-go areas, them all nationalist ones. Unionists haven't started doing them yet. They have what is known as protest barriers, in which they kind of disrupt main thoroughfares to sort of like force the British to take away the barricades. The British themselves, the British Army, call them protest barriers, don't regard them as the real thing. They have, for instance, as one where they say the RUC can come in, but the British Army won't. They know the British Army aren't going into that area anyway, so it doesn't make a difference. But the nationalist ones are for real, and the British government wants them down, but it wants a very, very softly approach. It doesn't want violence. The nationalist community also picked up an awful lot of support and sympathy in Britain at the time. So, and even the British media is with them at the time, so they don't want to be seen to be heavy-handed. So the trick for the British is to sort of convince the nationalists that they're safe. The British Army aren't going to go away immediately. And this is one of those the honeymoon period, when the British Army were, of course, actually welcome-ish, sort of. This was that period, and it sort of, the British Army with the guarantee it would be nice and safe and nothing nasty would happen. And it was only when the nationalists were convinced that would be the case, the barricades came down. There was no actual attempt to sort of like strike up the revolution here, comrade. It was remarkably, it was, as the majority of its leaders, it was reformist, it was civil rights rather than militant revolutionaries. Okay, so that's the end of the second phase of the no-go areas. We have to fast forward to August 1971, and everything has completely and utterly changed. First of all, the relationship between the British Army and the Catholic community just doesn't exist anymore. It is now absolutely in the gutter. Second of all, the reformist ideas have slightly gone out the window too. Now we are dealing with real revolutionaries. So the barricades go up again. And this time round, it's the long haul. Now, it becomes a little complicated. There's a reason why Derry tends to actually get most of the publicity rather than Belfast. Belfast becomes very, very ambiguous. Derry is solid. Derry manages to hold yet again another free Derry for almost a full year, from August 9th until the 31st of July 1972. Belfast is the odd one out. In Belfast, there was a concerted effort by the British. There was a decision made that there would be no barricades in Belfast. There would be no no-go areas in Belfast. So much so that they put most of the concentration of the army into Belfast rather than Derry. Part of the reason was the sectarian nature of Belfast. They were terrified the place would completely blow. So they wanted army control. So initially, the barricades came down in Belfast as fast as they went up. We even have quite dramatic stories of the paratroopers storming a barricade in the Turf Lodge, totally dismantling it. Whereas in Derry, they made one attempt to actually break through into the new Free Derry, and it totally failed. It totally failed for two reasons: a combination of civil rights, sort of passive resistance, demonstrations, and in actual fact IRA gun battles. There were like 23 gun battles in the Cregan in the space of 3 hours. 23 separate gun battles in the Cregan in the space of 3 hours on August the 19th, 1971. And also, when the British cleared a barricade, they tended to, they cleared a barricade, they broke through, they marched in, and then suddenly the barricade was actually built behind them again. So they found they were trapped. This was not really a good idea. So they decided to get out and leave Bogside and Cregan to the Bogsiders and the Creganites, if that's quite the word you use. And the British decided on a policy of Derry would be containment. That was what they called it. Belfast was no. There was absolutely no way the barricades were going up. It didn't work out that way. The rising tide of violence in the IRA actually made the nationalist areas extremely dangerous anyway, to the point where regular patrols as such didn't really take place. When they patrolled, it was almost like a mini incursion with helicopter support, and they inevitably came under attack. If they didn't actually come under attack by the IRA in a gun battle, they came under attack by the residents, who, this was the classic dustbin lids banging, whistles blowing, and the women shouting out, out, out. So they very much curtailed their activities. in West Belfast and North Belfast and nationalist areas. They didn't cede the territory, but they didn't control it either. Now it worked also, it worked both ways. It worked for the other side. The nationalist community never gained the control. It was never free Derry in Belfast the way it was in, it was never free Derry in Belfast. You know, it was just as simple as that. There was never this unambiguous, this is a no-go area. Barricades did go up. Sometimes they'd stay up for a remarkable long time. So occasionally you had incidences of the British Army just marching in, pushing them out of the way, and nothing happened. Then you had other incidences, such as in the Ardoyne in around June 1972, when a whole load of kids just built barricades around the Ardoyne right under the noses of the British Army. The British Army didn't do anything. So it was this strange halfway house. It's very, very ambiguous, and to be absolutely honest with you, I call it a work in progress. I really do feel more research is needed. And nobody I've talked to in Belfast actually seems to agree. Some say, oh yeah, but there were no-go areas. And there was no no-go areas at all. That's absolutely talking nonsense. There's no such thing. So it's okay, you know, definitely more work in progress. Now, we all know, just to cut a long story short, we're coming towards the end of the narrative bit, the Loyalists got in the Act. The Loyalists got in the Act initially. They wanted, the no-go areas were a problem for them. They hated the very idea. They particularly, interestingly enough, even in Belfast, Loyalists were particularly concerned about free Derry. They kind of knew Belfast wasn't really totally gone, in other words. But free Derry, they regarded as total, complete, not a rebel-held territory. This was an absolute affront to the Union. So they wanted the British to remove the barricades in Derry. The British were very, very reluctant. So they started creating their own. Again, it was like an extension of the 1969 protest barriers, only this time they were actually keeping people out. They were keeping the police out. They were keeping the army out. They were doing it only at weekends. The idea was to show, and it was also, I should point out, was UDA show completely, which made it rather different from previous, from the nationalist ones. They were doing it to show as a trial of strength, to show they could do it. Again, the British were very, very reluctant, and in July 1972, they switched to permanent no-go areas. With one dramatic incident of the Shankill area, where they built barricades in areas where some Catholic families were living, and the British Army actually put down their foot and refused to let them build those barricades. And there was actually a remarkable standoff with something like 10,000 UDA called in from around Northern Ireland to face down British soldiers. And with the British Army commander, General Ford, actually ringing the Secretary of State, Willie Whitelaw, to ask for permission to open fire if necessary, and getting the permission to do so. At the end, they negotiated a very strange compromise in which the area, the Woodvale area, would be jointly patrolled by UDA and British Army. Other than that, that was a kind of curious halfway house. Other than that, all the other UDA areas were straight UDA areas. The army weren't let in, the police weren't let in, they ran their own affairs. Again, to cut a very long story short, and this is the end of the narrative bit, it all came to an end on the 31st of July 1972 when the British Army staged Motorman. Probably the only really well written about part of the whole no-go experience. It was mercifully, except for little consolation to the families of the two people killed in Derry during Motorman, but otherwise, considering the fact that people were believed it was probably going to be the biggest showdown between the British Army and Republicans since the 1916 Rising, it was mercifully bloodless. And in in the Loyalist areas, of course, the UDA took down their own barricades. They helped the British Army. So most of that is kind of what is known of the no-go areas. I now kind of want to deal with what is not that well known about the no-go areas, because as you probably gathered, if you barricade a place off, you don't let the police in, you don't let the army in, you don't let any agents of the state in, you have de facto reality more or less seceded from the state, and you've got, in actual fact, a state to run. And they actually did. So if we go back to 1969, internal governance, the defence committees acted as a sort of executive. In Free Derry, which of course is the most well-known one, there was a very large executive. There were no less than 44 members. 15 of them actually belonged to left-wing groups. And that is kind of significant because the left obviously did see a sort of piracy commune kind of situation here and wanted to turn it into a sort of revolutionary commune. And the mainstream nationalist Derry did not want to do that. They didn't want to for several reasons. One, they were fairly middle of the road conservative Catholics themselves. You know, they liked Damon McCann and Bernadette Devlin, and they read Barricade Bulletin, but you wouldn't actually want these fellas to run your affairs. You know, that was kind of the attitude. They're nice people, but we don't actually want them running our. I mean, it's a bit, you know, communist, a bit red. So we're not having that sort of thing. And the priests told us not to anyway. So there was an element of that. But it wasn't, here's the other curious thing about it, it wasn't absolutely dyed-in-the-wool conservatism either. And here's where, first of all, there was actually the one, it may have been totally accidental, but the Defence Committee was the executive. But there was a parliament, and the parliament was everybody. There was actually direct democracy. There were, you see it in the Derry Journal, you see ads, public meeting tonight, major decision to be made, meet at Roosevelt Street, Free Derry Corner, all welcome. And you actually see it, there's a photograph of a whole load of people standing in Roosevelt Street voting, hands up. This was kind of, you know, total direct people's democracy. So there was kind of element of radicalism there. The other was law and order. As my supervisor, Tim Wilson, called it, the liberal vigilantes. They let it be known from the very start, oh, we don't do things like corporal punishment. Oh, no, that's nasty. What they did was what we would now call restorative justice. They tended, luckily for them, there was mostly minor crime they dealt with anyway. They didn't have to deal in those days with sort of major drugs gang. That it was just the occasional yob in the street, or the drunk making a nuisance of himself. It wasn't, there were burglaries, mind you. It wasn't too serious. So what they usually did with, they curfewed kids, they curfew teenagers. They'd say, you just simply stay off the street. They stayed off the street. Drunks, they took the wheels off their cars, or they took their car keys away from them until they'd sobered up. Oh, good logical sense, in actual fact. And there was one guy who had clearly mental problems, so they arranged for him to have psychiatric conditions seen to by a psychiatrist. The only time it turned nasty, this is about 1969, and it's mentioned in Paddy Doughty's, Paddy Bogside as it was called, book, was when they had a kind of people's court, was when a child rapist was brought before them. Now, I don't know what age the child was, it's not mentioned. But emotions were running extremely high and they actually passed a death sentence. And there was, Paddy Doherty was one of those kind of jumped up and said, no, we can't do this. This was 1969. And the whole thing was the British kind of rely on us to be nice guys. If it gets out there, we're shooting people or whatever is the agreed form of execution. This would be very, very bad news. So they kind of dropped the death sentence and ended up, he went from one extreme to the other, from being sentenced to death to actually they didn't know what to do with him. They didn't have prisons, so they more or less let him go. The Vigilantes, who kind of were the policing, also did things like traffic control, by the way. They directed traffic. They were a mixed bunch. They tended to be from 14-year-old boys to 71-year-old pensioners. Now, there were complaints about them kind of halfway through. There were Protestants still living in the Bogside area. And they were accused sometimes of picking on them, of being sectarian. Others, people kind of jumped up and said, no, they're not being sectarian. Now, this was hardly a ringing endorsement. They're just very officious. So it was considered that the Vigilantes weren't quite professional. And halfway through, in around September 1969, they dropped the already existing membership and they looked for ex-police officers to take over the role. There was also, again, remember, this was 1969, this was the non-revolutionary stage. There was also a suggestion, which the Nationalist Party thought was a very good idea, of actually bringing in the London Metropolitan Police to actually patrol the Bogside, because there was considered to be a bit of a professional deficit. They were all very good when they found a crime taking place, or if they knew absolutely, it was common knowledge, so-and-so had thrown the brick through the window the other day, we'll deal with him. But they weren't really good with sort of like burglaries and who did it. They weren't very good detectives, in other words. So there was kind of, okay, we don't know what to do here. Anyway, that all kind of ended in, again, October 1969, when the barricades came down and the British military police actually took over policing for a while. It changes again, of course, in 1971, 1972. Here we have a very different situation as regards both internal governance and policing, and yet it was actually remarkably similar. Now, I'm concentrating very largely on Derry because Derry really is the only one you can talk about, because Nationalist Belfast was just seemingly this strange halfway house, probably best exemplified by an attempt to set up a People's Court situation in West Belfast, fell flat on its face because the potential court members were actually getting British Army harassment, which says a lot about the sort of like who exactly was and was not in authority. In Derry, what you actually had as regards internal governance was a remarkable situation. They all went into autopilot. They remembered exactly what they were doing back in 1969. And so the same way they had the defence committees had organised with Ulster Bus, for instance, where, for instance, the buses could drive and where the barricades would be taken down in the day, then put up again at night, where rubbish could be left for the bin men. They actually went into the same sort of thing again. There was only one major difference. There was no defence committee. This was actually local communities, in quite literally at street level, knowing exactly what they had done the last time round and dealing with it again. This was most interesting because this was classic anarchism. This was almost pure anarchism. There was no overall governance. They did try to do something about it, though. They obviously didn't feel happy about that. And here's where we run up against the other little oddity difference from 1971 to 1969, the IRA, both of them. And that, of course, you frequently find in an awful lot of the literature, you will find the no-go areas discussed as IRA-controlled areas. That's actually not true. And part of the reason was because there were two IRAs. There were the officials and the provisionals. And though history has somewhat privileged the provisionals as being the strongest of the Republican paramilitary groups, actually back in the early 70s, the officials were their equal. And so they actually cancelled each other out. And it was also part of the problem why there wasn't an overall governance. The officials came up, being the revolutionaries, they wanted street committees that then voted for an overall governance. The provisionals damned that as the road to Moscow, and we're not having that commie stuff. The street committees actually got set up, but their role was quite ambiguous, so they didn't quite know what they were doing. But the one thing they did know was they looked after their streets' barricades. And they would meet in sort of like a local parliament, which Nell McCafferty gives a very good example of. Her street's local parliament was the bookie shop. So they'd meet and they would discuss important things like prettying the barricades up, you know, that they look ugly, so why can't we put flowers in them and things like that. They never got to the overall committee. That never happened, partly because nobody knew what was going on anyway and the provost just wouldn't play ball. Towards late May 1972, they decided on this was a provisionals idea, they decided no, they were going to elect a sort of People's Council. And that would take over as the main executive body. There were actually elections held, or to be more precise, there were nominations for elections held, but they were only, I think, something like 13 offices, let's call it that way, and only 13 people actually got nominated. So it was decided, okay, there's no election. They're deemed to be duly elected. I'm trying to remember the breakdown now. I think most of them were actually, 5 of them were independents. 7 of them, if that's not getting the numbers wrong, were actually Nationalist Party, which still existed. 2 of them were Sinn Féin or something like that. They surprisingly stayed in the background. I think they were trying to prove a point. It never got put into practice because by the time they were about to sit in office, motormen took place. So there was no free dairy for them to run. So it does mean that between August 1971 to July 1972, there was actually no government in Free Derry, and yet it ran itself. Law and order, again, you have the Vigilantes were called the Peace Corps, by the way. They were re-established. They were the same sort of people's courts, and they again surprisingly tried the sort of restorative justice techniques rather than anything harsh. However, there was a problem, and that was that the provisionals, not so much the officials, but the provisionals tended to run their own parallel justice system, which could be, let's say, rougher, to say the least. Not that provisionals couldn't occasionally be pulled up by the people's courts. One incident where a provisional was actually stopped for not paying his tax on his car. And he was actually dragged up to the people's courts. He got off by simply pleading that there was actually a boycott in the nationalist community of paying taxes. So he wasn't doing anything wrong. And they kind of went, oh yeah, all right, off you go. So law and order was, again, it was a kind of strange parallel. It continued pretty much as it had been in 1969, but there was the parallel of the provisionals doing their own rougher techniques. And occasionally, one source mentioned that if they had an absolutely serious criminal, the people's courts would, after this person had been called up several times and they didn't know what to do with him, they'd call in the IRA. They never gave details as to what the IRA would do, but we can imagine. Okay, that's the nationalists. Internal governance and law and order, the Loyalists, was somewhat different and yet somewhat similar at the same time. Internal governance was massively different. For a start, it was one single organisation, the Ulster Defence Association. They were the ones that set up the barricades. They were the ones that actually more or less ruled the roost. There was an interesting difference between them and the nationalist ones, was that you had, for instance, in the Irish Street area on the waterside in Derry was a UDA NoGo area, but they would take their orders from Belfast Command. You know, there was a degree of centralisation here that did not exist with the nationalists. There was a degree of a single authority. Law and order was, as you can imagine, somewhat different, and yet there were surprising similarities. As regards sort of like, again, they really, in the Belfast of those days, they were dealing with petty crime. That drugs weren't really that big an issue. But they, again, kind of dealt with petty criminals, juvenile delinquents, in kind of the same way. They went for restorative justice, but they put a different emphasis on it. They didn't have people's courts, they had court-martials. And the judges were UDA. The jury, they had a jury, was UDA. And in typical British military style, the defendant could actually ask an officer to defend them. And of course, the prosecution officer was UDA. So the whole thing was this one big, gigantic UDA show. And the penalties would be, they would give them military fatigues to do. They would put them on a charge and they would give them 1 week's military fatigue punishment fatigues to do. It basically meant doing exactly the same thing as the lads in the Bogside were meant to do. You know, sort of like do an old lady's shopping for her, sweep the streets, something like that. The UDA wanted to call it a court-martial and make it into military discipline and military punishments. So there was the huge difference there, or indeed similarities, between the Loyalist and the nationalist NoGo areas in both internal governance and justice systems. A brief word, I don't want to say too much about it because this has been very, very well. It's one of the few aspects of the NoGo areas that is very well written about, and that is the military. It's significant because it was the thing that really bothered the British. The Unionists just didn't like the idea of loss of control of a part of Northern Ireland. As far as they were concerned, Northern Ireland should have complete control of everywhere within the Northern Ireland region. This was the rebels taking control. The British were concerned because these were effectively free zones for paramilitary organisations. And there's no doubt about it, the figures are there. With the nationalists, there was the IRA definitely used the NoGo areas as free zones in which to recruit, organise, plan and actively carry out attacks and have somewhere to bolt to. The figures are there. The level of violence, Republican violence, had never been so big since the early 20s. It was on a huge scale. I'm no statistician, but I would, I guess, now don't quote me on this because I am no statistician, but I would guess that if Northern Ireland actually ever had a war moment, if it actually crossed that line into what would be recognised internationally as a period of guerrilla warfare. It was probably the spring and summer of 1972, when you had things like 95 gun battles a day taking place between the British Army and the IRA, between 40 and 50 of them taking place in Belfast alone. And the British Army was constantly saying they were frustrated. They would make occasional raids, even into Free Derry. They would make occasional raids, which always brought on trouble, and they would back off. Just an aside there, it's not often mentioned, bizarrely enough, but Bloody Sunday was probably the most infamous or famous dramatic British Army incursion into Free Derry. Frequently, the fact that it was behind the barricades is often ignored, but that they broke through the barricades. They did. So that was one of the reasons why there was such a heat on the British Army, and the British government were constantly having battles about this. About the British Army was looking for, give us the order, send us in. The British government was afraid of the death toll they thought would inevitably follow. Would be bad politically, and Willie Whitelaw was desperately trying to put together some sort of political solution, and he thought this would blow it. Likewise, Loyalist violence, the spate of sectarian killings started at around the time the barricades went up. Now, how many of the killings actually took place within, how many of the infamous romperings took place within the barricaded areas is hard to gauge, but an awful lot of them must have. Difference, however, strangely enough, between the Nationalists and the Loyalists is that once Motorman took place, Nationalist violence dropped dramatically. It made a difference. Loyalists actually didn't. Curiously enough, Loyalist violence does seem to have acted very independently of the NoGo areas. It seems to have been a coincidence rather than, in actual fact, a result of the barricaded areas. So that's just a brief word on the military. I just want to kind of round off before I kind of like end it with a brief little word on the comparative. I've more or less mentioned what they were going to be. The first off is, of course, the great puzzle as to why the Turkish enclaves are often ignored. They were ignored at the time. You know, there were several references in newspapers from the early 1970s to the Paris Commune, and nobody mentioned the Turkish enclaves, which were happening at exactly the same time in a very similar style conflict. Now, I have possibly a theory. The Turkish enclaves, I just point out, they'd come out of the 1963-64 civil war in Cyprus, the open fighting. Turkish villages, mostly rural, Turkish villages barricaded themselves off. There were loads of them, by the way. Turkish villages barricaded themselves off, and they actually stayed barricaded until the Turkish invasion of 1974. And the only reason they were dismantled was because the entire Turkish population of those villages moved to northern Cyprus. So there was no more village for them to actually barricade off. Now, there is one major difference between them and the NoGo areas, and it actually happens pretty early on. 1967, Turkey itself started sending government officials and even military officers to the Turkish enclaves to actually organize defense and governance. It would be the equivalent of the Irish government sending in officers from the Curragh and government officials from Kildare Street to wander around the bogside and tell them where they should build their barricades and what policies the government back in Dublin expected them to do. It was a completely different vibe. So maybe after 1967, they weren't properly NoGo areas. They'd become annexes of the Turkish state, if you like. The other reason I suspect, so again, this is one of those, don't quote me, this is a guess, but Northern Ireland's tendency to look at other conflicts and say, oh, that's us. They're the Catholics here, they're the Prods here. Sometimes it's open to debate who's the Tegs and who's the Prods in a lot of the conflicts, but in Cyprus it's kind of almost obvious. Turkish Cypriots were probably too loyalist, too Protestant for the nationalists to actually want to be connected with. And in some respects, the Turkish enclaves do actually bear a resemblance in some respects to the UDA controlled areas. They were sort of paramilitary rather than sort of like local defense committees. Paris Commune, again, it's very well known. I just want to emphasize things that aren't emphasized enough about it. Most people know the Paris Commune came up. They declared in March 18th the Commune, a revolutionary government. This caused immediate civil war. In Paris was placed under siege. What happened, however, one of the things that how the Commune came about was that it already came about by an already existing NoGo area. Montmartre was the bogside of its day. To cut a very, very long story short, the National Guard, who nearest equivalent I can think of actually to bring it bang up to date, would be almost like those Ukrainian citizens defense groups. They were sort of like when the Germans were besieging Paris, they set up the National Guard. The National Guard was locally based. It had each arrondissement has its own sections of the National Guard. The working class neighbourhoods in Paris were particularly niffed at the deal done with the Germans, and particularly when the Germans demanded the march down the Champs-Élysées. As a result, they actually barricaded their own areas and refused to recognise the government of Paris. They also had something like 171 cannon stored up in Montmartre. The French government wanted those cannon and sent troops to get those cannons. This was actually like Operation Motorman backfires dramatically. Not only did they get beaten back, but the National Guard poured out of Montmartre and eventually took over the entire Paris and declared the Commune. So it's had this locally based barricaded area type to begin with. On top of that, it never lost that. There was an overriding commune, but each arrondissement had its own kind of self-rule, and they elected deputies to the main commune. And the self-rule was pretty much like Bogside. They would meet once a week in their own parliament. It would be, say, a local theatre or a cafe. And the general populace would actually take votes on major decisions. Sometimes it didn't necessarily go the way, surprisingly, maybe, it didn't go the way the main commune with its left-wing ideology would have liked it to have gone. And the commune also went for the middle-class areas. And one particular interesting point was when the commune ordered all crucifixes to be taken off the walls of schools and hospitals. And the posher arrondissement said, no, we're not. And that's our democratic decision. And you can't do anything about it. And the main commune kind of went, that's true, okay. We accept that. So it was that sort of like, again, it was pretty close. It was definitely community-based. The next was, okay, speaks for itself, Barcelona. Indeed, Spain, 1936-37, and the anarchists. Their significance isn't, first of all, they were the most ideological. They didn't only barricade areas off, working class neighbourhoods off. They immediately went about doing what Eamon McCann and Bernadette Devlin wanted to do, did not get a chance to get done, wasn't allowed to do. They set about sort of like taking over factories and even cafes and nationalising them in the name of the people and setting up communes and sort of like self-governing industries and throwing the bosses out, basically. They replaced the police with the militia. They also established people's courts. They also came up with the phrase dual power. And its significance is that the left in 1969 in the North, People's Democracy, were very keen on they hoped the NoGo areas would go in exactly the same way. And they kept quoting dual power, we want dual power. And there was just the Fatty Dohertys of this world were saying, no way, we're not going to have any of that commie stuff here. So you have, obviously, the Barcelona anarchists. The other example is slightly cheating, and that is our own dear Limerick Soviet. Now, the reason I put that in is that it kind of escalated. Again, it was kind of an accident, almost a mistake. What actually happened was there was an attempt to rescue an IRA prisoner that went badly wrong. Not only did the IRA prisoner get killed, but 2 RIC officers got killed as well. As a result, the British declared Limerick a special military zone. It was short of martial law, but it meant that the army was in control and was deciding on emergency legislation and emergency orders. And the thing that really sparked off anger was that to enter Limerick City, you had to get a pass and to enter Limerick to work. And since there was about 5,000 people left outside in the suburbs that weren't actually in the area under Special Army control, but worked in the area, that meant they had to get a special pass every day, which was a serious disadvantage to them. And so it was decided, the workers, trade union, it so happened the IRA guy that was killed, by the way, was also a high-up trade union official and a well-known socialist. So the trade union movement decided to honour him, so to speak, by calling a general strike to get the army to back down. In so doing, again, it's an accident, they just wanted everyone out of work. And they wanted everyone. They wanted shopkeepers out of work. They wanted everyone, there's Limerick, to shut down. But obviously there would be food problems. You'd still needed to feed people. So they set up a strike committee that would actually look at things like, okay, on such and such a day, that shop, that bakery remains open. That bakery remains closed. So they decided who was working and who was not. Even the newspapers, you actually see the Limerick Leader, the local newspaper from the time, it actually has stamped on it, published by permission of the strike committee. And to enforce this, they set up workers' patrols, which effectively ended up policing Limerick. The RIC could actually feel they were losing complete control here. The army didn't know what to do. The RIC patrols were sort of taken over. Court cases weren't being heard because no one was actually being arrested and taken to the official courts. So effectively, Limerick, kind of without barricades, without actually an attempt to do so, had shifted out of government control. The Limerick Soviet, a name used incidentally from the very beginning, not by the strikers originally, by a panic-stricken Irish Times that reported that the knout of Bolshevism was being used to coerce 4 million people. The Limerick Soviet folded after about 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks precisely because it was too successful and too radical. People who had originally supported it, such as the clergy, local surrounding farmers who came in with food, who liked it because it was kind of nationalist and Republican, and then kind of panicked and kind of went, it's also Bolshevik, we can't have this sort of thing, started to veer away. Interestingly enough, the Labour Party, the Irish Labour Party, also could see that this was heading towards a major confrontation. The strike committee was talking about bringing the whole country out. And the Labour Party was, no, we don't want that. And so they negotiate at the end of the strike. So basically, that is kind of my take on sort of the no-go areas, their significance. I would just like to end maybe with one little concluding note from the Paris Commune. What did it mean to people? And this kind of props up again in sort of like what it meant for free dairy for people. One little incident from the Paris Commune of a teenage girl in a slum somewhere in Paris who was behind with her rent. And not only was she behind with her rent, but she was also feeling very cold and couldn't afford coal. It was probably rationed anyway. So she decided to break up the chair in the flat and feed it to the fire. The landlady was outraged. She hadn't paid her rent, and now she was breaking up furniture and decided to throw her out. Lo and behold, along come two members of the National Guard who suddenly intervene. Now, in the old days, if that had been the old gendarmerie, that would have been, oh God, that's dreadful. What kind of scumbag is she altogether? And they'd have taken her off to jail. It was, what, are you throwing her out? How dare you? You bourgeois enemy of the people, you. So it was the moment when sort of like, for once, the sort of petty tyrants, just getting really revolutionary and subjective here, the petty tyrants that people feel one way or another that they have, the boot was on the other foot. That was it. A sort of little bit of a moment when people in a particular neighbourhood got a taste for running their own affairs. And so that is the sort of like the significance maybe of no-go areas anywhere in the world. Did it work? The jury is out. The jury is out. Bogsiders can get very romantic about it still. Paris Commune, if the Bogside was being compared to the Paris Commune, it obviously at least left a legend, if nothing else. So the jury is out. The one thing they cannot help but notice is they don't happen in peaceful environments. They always happen in areas where there is actually a certain level of breakdown of the civil war order, whether it's out and out civil war or just civil disturbances. So that's that. I hope that didn't go on too long.
Thank you very much, Robbie. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's great to have such great new research on this underwritten topic. So we can get questions from the floor if you just want to raise your hand, or if you're online, just click the hand icon on the Teams screen. I can see Dominic Bryan has already done that, surprising enough. So Dominic, I'm going to give the floor to you to ask the first question.
Yeah, Robbie, I'm hands up first because I thought that was interesting. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, look, that was fantastic. It was so interesting, and the comparisons are so interesting. I suppose I'm fascinated by the way space and meaning give people identity. So I wanted to pick up on some of the things you said. First of all, I'm interested if you have a definition for a no-go area, because it seemed to me, I thought your sort of question mark about whether Belfast actually had them, I thought was interesting, but more particular, the relationship, the comparison between Belfast and Derry is interesting. And what you didn't mention, and I wonder whether you want to say something, is whether it made a difference of where Derry is. So if you're producing a no-go area and you're right at the border, that seems to me a very different context to the meaning of what you're doing than if you're doing it in Belfast, which is some way from the border. And do you think that that sort of geographical placing made a difference to how people conceived about what they were doing? And again, thank you very much.
Actually, yeah, my instinct is to say yes. I can find very little written material, or nobody would actually ever own up to these things. But if you stand on the wall on Derry and look across the Bogside and the Cregan, and you actually realise that that little bit of countryside you see in the distance, and not too distance, that's Donegal. You kind of go, yeah, that can't have not made a difference. The other thing I think that made a difference was being a majority. There was a confidence in Derry and the Bogsiders, Cregan, that you actually see it in August 1969 when the British Army arrive. There's triumphalism in the Bogside. They are having a party. In Belfast, it's relief. And people, you know, there's accounts of going into meetings of the defence committees afterwards, and they're all like chain smoking, sort of like, my God, what are we going to do next? Because they felt under attack. They felt the streets were burnt down. That sense of they were not near the border and they're a minority. So I think, yes, there's no doubt about it. Derry is a different story from that perspective. Even the fact that so many people in Derry all seem to have relatives in Donegal. You know, even something like that, they were so familiar with the Republic is just there. Whereas Belfast, it's quite a distance away. So yeah, I think it does make a difference.
Okay, thanks, Dom. I'm going to go Pavel first. In the room.
Well, thanks very much for the fascinating talk. I'd obviously like to speak to you at some stage if that would be possible. But I wanted to mention ask maybe two things really. First of all, you see, my understanding is such that basically the first 2 free days would be pretty much, you know, celebrated as some sort of a, I don't know how to put it, a triumph, you know, of downtrodden, you know, people that, in a way, you know, a triumph, or at least, you know, an assertion, you know, of all, you know, civil rights by, broadly speaking, you know, the civil rights movement. Yeah. If you know what I mean. Yet, you see, at the same stage in 1960, well, not necessarily exactly at the same stage, but in the summer of 1960, basically in 1969, you have an exodus of the Protestant population from the West Bank in Derry city. Well, obviously, there are barricades, you know, being erected around the Fountain area, which until this day, you know, remains, so to say, you know, the only Protestant enclave on the West Bank. Obviously, your man William King from the Fountain is beaten to death. So, well, basically, somebody had to do it, or somebody had to force it. You know, and I just wanted to ask how do you think you know it adds up with that whole, you know, portrayal of Free Derry, you know, as being, you know, just peaceful people, you know, who asserted their, you know, civil rights, you know, against the state. Oh,
I never said they were always a peaceful people. Well, for a start, I mean, there was so much in that I researched. I just didn't have. That's a strange clock. You know, didn't want to overdo the time. But I mean, there are other issues. I mean, for instance, there were still Protestants living in the Bogside area, and they frequently complained about being attacked. And they were the attacks were actually publicized in the Barricade Bulletin, the left wing. Free Derry, but then they were probably one of the few ones saying, no, we have to be genuinely non-sectarian, we have to be, and here we are attacking Protestants, and that's a terrible thing. But the fact is, they were taking place. Whatever about the allegations about the Vigilantes, the Peace Corps, whether they were just two officials or whether they were sectarian or not, that's open to question. Crowds of youths were attacking Protestants living in the Bogside. There is no doubt about that. So I'm not for any minute trying to say they were wonderful, fantastic people. There is, contrary to the popular myth, there is actually a history of sectarian violence in Derry as well. It's not like here, but there is one in Derry. And actually, it quite amazed me. I mean, they picked the nicest spot to have their sectarian riots. And the lads from the Fountain and the lads from the Bogside used to meet basically in beautiful town city centre of the old walled city, and that's where they decided to have their sectarian riots. You know, so I'm not in any way actually saying they were wonderful and fantastic, freedom-loving. They had wonderful and fantastic freedom-loving people up in charge. That's not unusual in Irish history. It goes right back to 1798. You frequently have these terribly enlightened, idealistic leaders, you know, wanting to bring the rights of man and the republic. And then you had, yeah, but can I kill Catholics or can I kill Protestants? You know, at the kind of different level. You see it in Derry in 1969. Eamon McCann was complaining about it. Eamon McCann was complaining about going to a meeting, and he was saying, yeah, and we will have our civil rights. And he was saying, halfway through the meeting, he kind of at one stage said, every time I say we'll have our civil rights, you think I'm saying we'll get the Protties, aren't you? You know, that's not what I'm saying.
The other bit I wanted to ask you, see, is basically the first and the second 3 days are more or less, you know, I actually, in preparation for your seminar today, I was watching the film called, you know, NoGo.
Yeah.
Well, you certainly know that film. It was quite recent. It was from the 2000s anyway. And over there, one person basically says that, well, he believes that over time, the Free Derry story would be interpreted as a part, it would be incorporated into, you know, the broader, you know, Republican, you know, narrative that it was the Republicans, you know, that established it, you know, and ran it, you know, and whatnot. It actually wasn't. It was, you know, the people connected to the civil rights movement and normal residents. Now, obviously, you had your Sean Keenans and your Johnny Whites, you know, and whatnot, you know, involved in that as well, but it wasn't a Republican project as such. Would you say that the third Free Derry, so from internment, you know, onwards, was it a Republican project?
The second, you mean?
No, the third.
The third.
From internment, because you see the reason why I understand internment was the reason, you know, why it, how you call it, appeared. And well, you said there was, you know, no governing structure, that basically people, you know, ran their affairs, you know, street by street, you know, more or less, and the officials wanted one sort of a political or one sort of a government, provisionals wanted the other one, and then the provisionals, you know, were running their own sort of, you know, justice system, which not necessarily everybody, you know, agreed with or wanted, you know, to go along with. But, well, apparently there's much more, you know, because there's no central defense committee. There's no, you know, central authority, if you like, and basically you have the two groups, you know, perhaps already, you know, at odds with each other in many ways, you know, which are basically the main, you know, source, you know, of influence and the main, I would imagine, the main bodies which can actually, you know, execute any, you know, any power. And just touching on that, you mentioned that, well, basically, history almost, you know, airbrushes the official movement. Actually, the official movement was quite powerful, you know, at that stage. Would you say that the execution of Ranger Best, who was killed, you know, in Craig and Wild League by the officials, led to the collapse of the Third Free Derry in a way?
I wouldn't say it led to the collapse of Free Derry. It led definitely to the collapse of the officials. Now, it wasn't the only thing that was leading to the collapse of the officials. One, their own internal arguments. They were moving away very largely from the paramilitary struggle. But it damaged them in that there were something like at Ranger Best's funeral, there was something like 5,000 people turned up at it. There was absolute fury. There are great ironies about Ranger Best. He had actually been, incidentally, a vigilante in 1969. And not only that, but before the officials actually picked him up and shot him, he'd been chatting away to old friends of his on the barricades, who had actually only hours earlier been throwing stones at the British Army. And he knew that. I mean, this was the ambiguity and the ambivalences of Northern Ireland generally. But yeah, certainly Ranger Best was, if you like, it was the final straw. Certainly in Derry, the officials were finished after Ranger Best. There's no doubt about that. And incidentally, I mean, the provisionals shamelessly and ridiculously, in a way, used that. They actually said, we'd never have shot Ranger Best, like, be foot. They wouldn't have shot range at best. The officials just got there first. Yeah, no doubt about it, it kind of finished the officials. Whether or not the third no-go area was a Republican, the Republicans played an extremely important role in it, yeah, but I wouldn't say it was a Republican project. Internment now, again, I didn't, in the thesis, for instance, I actually had an entire chapter on why the relationship with the Catholic community and the British Army broke down. Now, I was worried about it because it's actually very well-worn territory, but I thought it was absolutely necessary to understanding why the third no-go area came into being. Certainly, you know, republicanism as an ideology, whether or not it's actually the IRA, was never exactly distant from the thoughts and sentiments of the nationalist community generally. It was easy for them in periods of crisis to become Republican. The whole point was, what you had by August 1971 was you had, as far as the nationalists were concerned, Stormont was dragging its feet on reform. The British Army had become repressive. And the sense of the state is against us, which is what is constantly, it was the thing that the Northern Ireland nationalist community has felt for probably the last 100 years, certainly up to that time, the last 50 years, that the state is not our friend. The state is always against us. Other countries, solid citizens, can call their police. They can look upon the police as theirs. We can't. Even when we call them, we kind of have to, because there's nobody else. But they're not with us, they're against us. And then in August 1969, there was the hope that that would all change. By August 1971, they thought, no, it isn't. It's exactly the same. And internment was the last straw. It was perceived to be so gratuitous, if you like, and the way it was carried out, that it was just the last straw. So there was the nationalist community was finished with the British state at that point.
We'll take a question from the back.
Yeah, no, great talk again. As you kind of said at the beginning, I knew quite a bit about when they started and when they stopped, but not much about in between, so it's fantastic to hear about that. Now, sorry if my thought doesn't have like a proper question mark at the end of it, but I was just sort of, when you were talking about sort of the comparative examples that you mentioned, my mind kind of went to some of the occupations that were done by like Mohawk warrior societies, particularly in and around Miners Lake. I was just wondering if you were familiar with those or if you excluded those for a specific reason. Or...
I'll be absolutely honest with you and say no, but I am always on the mooch for as many comparative, as far as I'm concerned, that is very much a work in progress. I want as many comparatives as I can get.
I believe is actually still around. I don't think the government's ever reclaimed the territory. So I think Gananoque, I think it's called, is still sort of there, internally run. Okay, I just
no, that's you've given me somewhere else to look at. So
okay, going to Peter online. Peter, if you want to unmute.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Robbie. That was really interesting. A couple of questions I think that relate a little bit to what Pavel had said, because I was really surprised that it wasn't more Republican from the outset. Or when I say Republican, I'd already assumed it was the people who would go on and become the provisionals, even before the split, or that it would be kind of more older school Republicans. So even if it's not the guys who go on to be the provisionals, it's kind of like authority figures in those communities, like that there would have been. So is there not, I guess what I'm saying is there not an overlap? The way you talked about it there as being distinct from what was going on in the Loyalist communities, are there no known Republicans who are involved in these kind of committees? And then equally, and then if not, why? What you kind of presented an image there as if both the IRAs kind of disengaged and were focused very much on military, which is understandable, but then it seems surprising that they didn't have any interest in the politics there of the revolutionaries to have some kind of say. And so I'm wondering, is there any overlap of people who are on these committees? And then equally, what's the SDLP doing, and what are people like Ivan Cooper and John Hume doing? Because of course at least Hume I know lives in this, is MP for the area, and it's still a different political authority. So what are people like? What is the SDLP doing, and what's Hume doing? I'm surprised that none of them have been mentioned either, and I'd be fascinated to know. I mean, it was fascinating what you did cover. I'm sure there's plenty more, but to know why Republicans weren't more interested, and what the SDLP and figures like that would do. Again, I'm presuming that some of the people you talked about are SDLP types, but what were people like Hume saying?
Well, the first thing was they were actually involved in the committees back in 1969, yeah, but they were, like the left, they were a minority. The thing to remember maybe about Republicans in 1969 was that they were actually not a major faction. Actually, it's one of those, again, history has kind of privileged the last 50 years as with an image, if you like. It's actually worth remembering that for the 50 years before the Troubles broke out, Ulster nationalists were actually not very Republican. When, for instance, the treaty was signed in 1921, most of the IRA units in the north supported it. When the Civil War broke out, they actually came down south and joined the Free State Army. They did not actually fight, as may surprise people to know, they did not actually fight on the Republican side, because there was always this, because of the divisions in Northern Ireland society, because of the realities of partition, there was always this, let's call it a pragmatic streak. It was all very well for them down in Munster and Cork. You know, there it's just loads of nationalists fighting the British. But here it's sort of like our neighbours actually put out the Union Jack. So it's a totally different story. So Republicans as such, as in rip-roaring Republicans who want to unite Ireland by force of arms, were actually very, very low down the scale in the nationalist community in the north for the first 50 years. The Nationalist Party was the dominant political force. The church, you can't overlook that, the church hated Republicans. And again, I maybe should have emphasized this in the talk. There was, again, it was time constraints, but the church organized peace marches in the Bogside during Free Derry, with in some cases like 5,000 people turning up at a sort of anti-IRA march in the Bogside, organized by the church and a women's peace coalition. So there was no unanimity about the IRA. One thing, the kind of not so much a slogan, but a quote from 1971 when the barricades went up again. It was kind of saying, where the real power lies. When the barricades came up again, it was sort of like back in 1969, the IRA helped us organize our defense. But here, we're defending the IRA. We, the people, they're not defending themselves. And you actually see it in British Army documents, security documents. Until about 1972, when the IRA itself actually began to look like a really seriously dangerous organization. You see it as late as December 1971. British Army are saying, the British Army are actually split on the issue. They're not all in agreement. They want to burst in there and take over Free Derry. Some of them are totally against it. They think it would be a very, very bad idea. And one of the senior officers who was against it actually said, our issue is not the IRA. They can be easily dealt with. But every time we send in an attempted patrol, the dustbin blades start banging. Sirens start going off. People start blowing whistles. Kids come and start throwing stones at us. The people don't want us. And they're far more formidable. You actually see it, the Derry Young Hooligans. They are actually turn up in British Army reports as far more formidable and frightening to the average squaddy than the IRA. They're terrified of them. Frequently, the average squaddy out on patrol has more dealings with the lads with the petrol bombs and the bricks than they are likely to get shot at by the IRA. So Republicans were not as strong as we think in 1969. And in 1972, There were two organizations, both kind of cancelling each other out, both kind of vying for power with each other. And still, in the meantime, the church hadn't gone away. The Nationalist Party had been largely replaced by the SDLP. And in answer to your question, yeah, the SDLP, John Hume is an interesting one. John Hume was on the Defence Committee back in 1969. In 1972, he didn't want to have anything to do with the barricades, because his whole thing was, I am actually the MP for this area. I'm the political representative. I'm the legal representative, and this is usurping my power. So he actually didn't want anything to do with the no-go areas. So the SDLP kind of withdrew. You see it in the election for, or the election that didn't take place, for the nominations for the committee in 1972 that didn't, at the end of the day, sit. Nationalist Party put themselves forward, SDLP didn't. They were boycotting it. They didn't want this. Simple as that. So there were two, it was too fractional, if you like. Unlike the Loyalist areas, there was no single authority. There were different authorities, so to speak, all of them very strong authorities, the church, the SDLP, the IRA. So they all effectively, none of them could dominate. It was just as simple as that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's great. That's really interesting. Thank you, Robbie.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Liam?
Thank you very much, Robbie. It's really enthralling account. Just at the level of concepts, I mean, the word community is very warm sounding, but it is quite an elastic and slippery concept, which actually has come through in the discussion, I think, when you try to apply it to specific historical situations. People similarly, if you put people in front of, court or police, it becomes quite warm and fuzzy and attractive. The reality may be different. Anyhow, my question is about tarring and feathering. Going back to your theme about law and order, I can't quite remember, but is it September or late 1971? You have the first tarrings and featherings of factory girls in Derry. How does that fit into your narrative?
It doesn't. It's largely, that's the IRA, or the Loyalists did it too, but they did it later. That was specifically the IRA. It was never the people, both. And mostly the provisionals, though the officials did at times as well. Mostly for girls going out with British soldiers, which was a no-no for the IRA. It ran very independently of the no-go areas. It didn't have to be in a no-go area for it to happen. It didn't have to be during a no-go area period for it to happen. I mean, it's continued. I mean, there are still, as far as I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, there are still punishment attacks taking place today. Now mostly carried out, I believe, by dissident Republicans and kind of rump UDA in Loyalist areas. And they've had a long, long history. The only person who's actually, to my knowledge, dealt with it in any great detail has been Andrew Silk. He, however, was mostly looking at the 1990s. He was looking at the very end of the Troubles. I was looking at the very beginning. So there wasn't an awful lot of crossover between us. But those were paramilitaries, and they kind of ran parallel to the no-go areas, also very independently. And the provisionals in particular, I was surprised as early as October 1970 now, they actually announced that in the Anderson Town area, that they were having a crackdown on what they called antisocial behaviour. And this was at a time when there were no-go areas. That's so bad English. There weren't any no-go areas at all. But they were already, stamping their authority. They were already getting ready, if you like, for the offensive which is what, to a very large extent, this was about. You're going to have an offensive against the state. You don't want local population actually having anything to do with the state. So you take away the state's policing role as well. So it made perfect sense from a revolutionary perspective, if you like. But it was very largely independent. It ran parallel with the no-go areas, and at the same time it outlasted them for years, right up to today. So it's not entirely similar, but yeah, it definitely took place within them as well.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got two hands up on screen, so I think we'll just finish with these. So Karen first.
Yes, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I've been trying to work out the geographical sort of extent of no-go areas in Belfast around about 1972, because I was doing a PhD on the British Army observation posts there. And I kept coming across, conflicting geographical information. To me, it sounded conflicting in the commander's diary about barricades being taken down and barricades being put up again. The one I found most information on was actually the UDA no-go area on the Shankill side, where they were sponsored with tankers. They were sponsored by local businesses, and assisted. And so that on the one hand, that's something that I found quite interesting. And I was wondering whether you came across, I haven't seen this publication, Barricade Bulletin. I'd love to take a look at it. And I wonder if you could tell me where I would find copies of it. And also, did you come across any other sort of geographical maps or spatial definitions, or any kind of, were there shifting boundaries to these no-go areas? And has anyone studied the geographical or the architectural, the spatial aspects of them so far? And if so, where I could find any maps or information on that?
First of all, as regards Barricade Bulletin, there aren't that many copies of it, but you can get it up in the Linden Hall Library in the Troubles collection that they have. It has absolutely everything. It has the total feel of, you can almost smell the CS gas. It's very much DIY kind of put together, frequently just one sheet. It's amazing nowadays. A sort of a laptop and a printer can make anything look professional. This was quite clearly not a laptop and a printer. It's very amateur looking. At one stage, it almost looks like your 6-year-old was sort of like, drawings and writing on it and stuff like that. But it is very interesting. It's the Derry Labour Party paper. It's Amy McCann's particular crowd. As regards other material, you're right. I ran up against exactly the same problem. I'm so glad to hear about somebody else being totally confused by information I was getting out of Belfast. Belfast was an absolute maze of confusion, is all I can call it. There's very little written about it. I actually have to admit I don't understand why. And this is my complete and utter puzzlement, but there is very little that has been written about it. The map, the free areas themselves didn't really change geographically that much at the time. They'd be very different now, because particularly in North Belfast, where you had, say, barricades going up in areas now which don't contain the demographic group that put the barricades up 50 years ago. It's as simple as that, because North Belfast is continuously changing. Shifting backwards and forwards. Well, actually, it's mostly kind of nationalists on the rise, as far as I can make out. No, the barricaded areas tended to be pretty solid where they were, in what were kind of recognized as recognized communities. There weren't many, some communities that hadn't changed since about the early 20th century. There would have been Catholic areas or Protestant areas in 1912, or still Catholic areas and Protestant areas in 1972. So where the barricade should be put up, it was never really much of an issue. Everyone instinctively knew, put them there. Don't put them there, put them there. Now it would be much more confusing. But no, frustratingly, very little work on them that I could find. You know, maybe some postgrad student from Mongolia did some extremely wonderful work in 1975 that hasn't been translated into English yet, in which case, if he did, I'd really like to read it. So, but as of yet, I don't know. So that's probably a very disappointing answer.
No, it is, like you say, it's good to hear that somebody else has had this similar problems in locating these things, particularly.
We should form a club.
Yeah. I was actually told there was a map of the British Army observation posts in the Troops Out movement, and I've scoured all of the boxes in Dublin and in London, most of the ones in London, looking for this fictional map that I've never been able to find. But anyway, maybe it does exist. I'm sure it'll be in the commander's diary somewhere.
Well, if you ever find it, let me know. I'd really love to. I think it's a legend myself. I don't really believe it's like Planet 9.
Had maps of it, though, surely. You know, somewhere in those files that are closed in queue, I suspect there's got to be maps there somewhere of where these no-go areas exactly were and where the observation posts were.
I think there has to be. Yeah. And I think, but the thing is that there's an awful lot of stuff kept from us still.
Yes.
I know this from my own experience because I came across, this was really frustrating. I came across a RUC report. This was actually in 1969 on the activities of Irish Special Branch in the north. And I wanted to see it because the reason Special Branch would have been up there was to keep an eye on the IRA. And where would you have best have seen them without being constantly harassed? It would have been somewhere like Fleet. So I thought this would be absolutely brilliant. I really, really would want to read this report. It might lead me on to finding somebody else. And was told, this is weird because it was on the thing in the Northern Ireland Public Records Office. But when I asked for it, they said, no, we're sorry, we can't give you that. And I decided, well, I'm going to appeal this. And they said the problem was that names are actually mentioned. And I said, now, this is actually true, but I wouldn't expect them to believe me. I have a terrible memory for names. If I don't write it down, I won't remember it. So I could see it was Inspector Blab, and I would totally, if I won't write his name down. I'll just say Inspector X, and that'll do. I won't remember. But they didn't buy it. So I was refused. So there is still stuff. I have a feeling, I don't want to, Jesus, it sounds like a conspiracy theorist, but I have a feeling that we're not getting the juiciest of stuff. We might not for another 20 years until they're all safely dead. And that's the problem, maybe.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you very much for your answer.
Not at all.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to give the last question to Stephen.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that, Robbie. Very, very interesting. My question echoes what one of the other questioners asked, and a little follow-up on if that's okay. What I was wondering is that I think this might apply more to Loyalist areas and the Republican areas because of the victims of sectarian murder being brought into the no-go areas rather than attacks being launched from the no-go area. And I was wondering if there was any sort of disagreements amongst the more civic-minded authorities within no-go areas as to things that were happening at night that were, extremely violent, or if there was opposition to it, or if the attacks were carried out under the noses of some of the more civic-minded authorities. And as a little follow-up, I was just wondering if Republican no-go areas had contact with Loyalist no-go areas and vice versa?
As regards to sort of like the civic-minded, the answer is yes and no. The answer is yes, there were. But it tended to usually be bad news for those that kind of protested. Obviously, the grip of the UDA was stronger. Now, it should be pointed out that the UDA was, I mean, of all paramilitary organizations in the north in the last 50 years, I mean, I know the A in their title doesn't mean army, but of all the organizations that was entitled to call itself an army, the UDA was. I mean, at their height, there were 40,000 of them. That is probably bigger than the Irish Army. I haven't checked it, but it probably is. Yeah, I actually had to admit, I had a bit of a problem here in that just because of who I am, I actually desperately wanted there to be the fractionalism in the Loyalist areas that there were in the Nationalist areas, because I didn't want it to make it look as if, oh yeah, the Loyalist areas were totally dominated by the UDA and they were all a load of bigots, and the Nationalist side, they were all wonderful Democrats who argued about everything. But the truth of the matter is the dominance of the UDA certainly set off something like a military dictatorship in a way. You do get dissenting voices. You had, I've totally forgotten his name now, Reverend somebody, a Presbyterian minister in 1972 who very bravely condemned the UDA and the UVF from the pulpit. He was forced out, ended up in London. You get sort of subtle protests. The Belfast Telegraph letters page can actually be very interesting. At the time of July 1972, when the UDA was setting up their no-go areas, you got two classes of, you got dissenting voices that didn't like it. Now, they could hide behind, if you like, they could, and I don't mean that to sound, that sounds judgmental, and I don't mean it to be. It was quite right to hide behind it. They were anonymous. They would be Citizen, Joe Blogs, East Belfast, you know. You had one particularly, I remember one particular letter that was particularly strong about a man coming home from work, and the bus was stopped by teenagers and UDA, tartan gangs and UDA, and they got on the bus and they ordered everyone out. I presume they were going to make use the bus for a barricade. And the man started to protest and kind of realized that he did not have the backing of the bus. Nobody was going to protest along with him. So he kind of, it was a day like today, it was rainy, so he kind of buttoned up his coat and walked through the rain to home. But he wrote this kind of stinking letter into the Belfast Telegraph, and his kind of end punchline, so to speak, was 30 years ago I fought in World War II against the forces of fascism. Now I find the forces of fascism are much closer to home. And signed it something like a loyalist but not proud. So there were very definitely dissenting voices, but it was not like the nationalist ones. Not that the nationalist dissenting voices did not have intimidation issues either, but there was more of a chance of getting away with it, if you like, than there was in loyalist areas, because the dominance of the UDA seemed to be so strong. That seemed to be the overwhelming fact. Now, I should point out the no-go areas in the loyalist no-go areas actually lasted an incredibly short time. They only lasted a month, and they actually won. They achieved their purpose to an extent. The British Army moved against the nationalist ones. How they would have sort of petered out, so to speak, how they'd have developed had they been as long as the nationalist ones, I don't know. That's into almost speculative history. We can't imagine. All we know is the UDA took the initiative for that month, and it was very much their show. And they were incredibly disciplined, which maybe is actually surprising given how the UDA sort of ended up in the end with sort of like faction fighting and feuds. was the degree to which they were incredibly this strong, disciplined organisation. And I suppose you couldn't fight that. But yeah, there were plenty of loyalists, I would say, living within loyalist UDA-dominated areas who probably weren't happy. And then there were probably lots who probably didn't like the UDA watch, but were terrified by the way the summer of 1972 was turning out. You actually see it in official documents. there was a real fear. You know, this wasn't sort of like hysterics, so to speak. This was quite sensible individuals believed that civil war was imminent. The British believed civil war was imminent. The army were arguing civil war was imminent. So people were really scared. It did look it in 1972 in the summer. So people were really scared. So maybe there was also a case of, well, if it comes to an absolute fight between us and them, well, I'd rather have the UDA. So maybe don't complain. They may defend us yet. Might have been a lot of the attitude. But yes, it was hard to find dissenting voices. And it seemed to be that they weren't as free to dissent as in the nationalist areas. So,
okay, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you everyone who's contributed to the discussion. We've run over quite a bit. I think it's just a credit to just how important and interesting Robbie's work is, that it's stimulated such a great discussion in Q&A. We look forward, Robbie, to seeing this come forward into publications. It's really pioneering work. So just I hope today has brought that point home to you, that you do need to bring this forward to publication, because there's a tremendous audience of people who want to discover, to want to read what you've researched and discovered on this subject. Can I ask those of you who are still with us, both in the room and online, just to thank Robbie in the usual way by giving him a round of applause. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. We don't have a seminar next week, but in 2 weeks we have. Just bear with me. Yeah, 2 weeks we have our own Neil Jarman of this parish. Will be talking about Belfast's rivers, from resources and problems to rights and possibilities. So join us on the 28th of March, same time, 4:30 for Neil Jarman. Okay, thanks very much and good afternoon.
Good evening.
Thank you. Thanks.
That was great.
see you.
Very good.
Hello. Well, that was very